and some short-term climate reductions. Now, this is not necessarily what we would like to see, the reason we would want to see it, but this is an interesting indication that when people actually have been not commuting as much on the roads and a variety of other things, we've actually seen climate reductions steeply dropping in a very short period of time. The signal for this that a lot of people are looking at is what could be institutionalized as we move forward. But certainly we don't want to get climate reductions this way. The EU, the European Union, is starting to build on this, though, and there's some really interesting developments coming out of out of Europe as they look at how are they going to invest going forward. And Bonnie, if we could go to the next slide, one of the things that we've seen is it's almost a €500 billion plan that has been signaled is going to be unveiled next week. And what they've done in Europe is taken their Green Deal program, which was an investment in green technology and climate reduction strategies, and turned it into a recovery plan for the European Union. They'll be investing in a number of different areas, obviously wind and solar among them, but hydrogen, and huge investments in charging infrastructure for electric vehicles and incentives for electric vehicles. Actually, these are some of the things that we've been sharing with policymakers would be really important to do to invest in a strong green economy in California and the United States, among other sites. Now, there are people already poised to take advantage of this. There's a new fuel cell maker who is emerging, interesting company out of New York. Horizon Fuel Cells is now turning into a company called Hyzon Motors, and they're going to be developing buses, trucks, even vans. They're also building this around a high-powered fuel cell. So interestingly, as we've seen companies move from energy storage into providing vehicles built on that energy storage, we're now starting to see some fuel cell developers moving into providing vehicle platforms. They've also just opened an Australian subsidiary. We're also we're seeing some other interesting announcements from users of these vehicles. In Sweden, a company called Oatly has committed to zero emissions for all of their heavy deliveries. So not just in lighter trucks, these are Class 8 tractors that they'll be using to deliver their oat milk product. And not just in Sweden, their first product will be driven by electric vehicles, electric trucks later this fall in Sweden, but they are going to be bringing this to the United States as well. So it's a really interesting signal from another large and innovative supplier that they want to move this into their supply chain to reduce carbon. Some of the major vehicle suppliers also moving into this space. VW says that they're going to be offering via an upfit partner called ABT, an electric van with a range of about 82 miles built on their transporter platform, the e-transporter. One of the things that this has real business case value, particularly in Europe right now, this is a ubiquitous platform in Europe. And they're finding that if you operate this vehicle, you save a lot of funds just because you avoid congestion charges, say in London, or you can operate in some of the zero emission city centers that Europe has instituted in many of its cities. So there's a lot of value to the end user to have access to this vehicle. Finally, we all continue to see the range extensions and price drops we're seeing in energy storage. Now there's a battle around how to turn these into long life batteries. There's 3 really interesting firms, 2 of which you've heard of, 1 you may not have, that are working on no cobalt long life batteries. Tesla is working with CATL, which is one of the major cell makers worldwide in China, to develop this long life million-mile battery. When they introduce it, according to reports from Reuters, it will be in China to start. GM also says it's working on a million-mile battery. This is beyond their already announced Ultium battery, which was a new development and a lower cost product they'll be building in Ohio. And finally, a Chinese company called S-Volt says that they will start production on a zero cobalt battery, a long life battery, coming up sometime this year. So some really interesting developments going on there in the news. So with that, even in the midst of the global slowdown, we see these trends towards moving towards continued lower carbon and lower emission platforms and fuels. One of the things that we need to continue to stay on course is having those right tools, those guidance strategies, those policies. And Alicia's got an update now on a really interesting new policy toolkit coming out of Chicago. Alicia?
Yes, we do. Bill, really excited to introduce our next topic. Our own Lily Paul has worked very hard on a tool along with several other partners, looking at the opportunities of advancing zero emission freight in Chicago. Lily, I'm going to turn it over to you to give us your update.
Thank you, Alicia. So I'm an associate project manager here at CALSTART based out of the Midwest. And as she said, I'm going to go over the Chicago Commercial Electric Vehicle Readiness Guidelines. Now, these are aimed at medium and heavy duty commercial electric vehicles. So this was based on the city of Chicago. The city of Chicago has over $564 billion worth of goods passing through annually, and 76% of that freight tonnage is transported via trucks. One of 7 of the vehicles on the urban interstate highway system is a truck. So there's a lot of emissions that are traveling through that area. There's also an estimate that long haul freight traffic is expected to double by 2045. So now is the time to prepare for future electrification. The cost of retrofitting a property can be 4 times greater if you do wait and have to go back and change that property. So now is the time to change this. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the guidelines within our document here is that at least 1 or 20% of loading docks and depot spaces, whichever is greater, should be prepared for the installation of charging stations. So the reason that we called out loading docks and areas such as that is any opportunity that a truck is stopping for a scheduled stop at the same location, that's an opportunity to be charging. So we put these guidelines in place for planners and developers to have that infrastructure ready. Now, this means that you can have the conduit and aspects like that ready to go, and you can add the actual infrastructure later, just as a way of cutting down the cost. Now, these guidelines did come out in line with the Chicago EV Readiness Ordinance that was passed April 24th, and our guidelines came out a few weeks before that. And that ordinance requires that new commercial developments with 30 or more parking spaces or residential developments with 5 or more units must have at least 20% of spaces be EVS ready. So this guideline will help accomplish that goal. Next slide. All right, so this is just an overview of the steps that you can take that we include in the guidelines here. I'm not going to go through them all now because we're a little pressed for time. I just want to call out step 4 does require that you engage with ComEd. This guideline was again planned for the city of Chicago. So if you're not in Chicago, that step is just engage with whoever your utility provider is. And this is located on the last page of the commercial EV readiness guidelines. Next slide. All right, and funding for this project was provided from the Chicago Department of Transportation, Illinois Department of Transportation, as well as FHWA CMAQ funding. So I just wanted to give a shout out to that. Next slide. Okay, and here you can see some of the participants that contributed to the development of these guidelines. So we really wanted to make sure we had a lot of people involved to make sure these were accurate and really helped planners and developers have the right things in place for future electrification. Next slide. All right, and so in conclusion, you can find them at that URL listed there. So that's the City of Chicago's website, and that's the Drive Electric Chicago page. And that right there is a screenshot of what it looks like. So if you go ahead and click on that cover page for the guidelines, you can go ahead and view all of the guidelines there for free. Thank you.
Great job, Lily. Thank you so much for that excellent presentation and for all your hard work on developing those guidelines. Bill, I'll turn it over to you for our next segment.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks, Lily. It's a great tool, and if you have more information on that, we've got the chat box and the question box open here, and you can also reach out to Lily offline, or just follow the links that we'll put up on our website later today, so that you can get all the resources. Those kinds of tools are something that we're actually developing with our partners worldwide. It's actually very exciting right now, particularly through our global commercial vehicle Drive to Zero program. And we're learning some of the best practices around the world in that process, and also working with key stakeholders and on-the-ground partners who are really starting to drive action forward. Joining us now is Cristiano Fasagna. He is our Global Director of Drive to Zero, and he's got an update with what our partners north of the border in Canada are actually setting in motion. Cristiano, welcome.
Thank you, Bill. As you know, Drive to Zero really aims to align actions worldwide to speed the deployment of zero-emission commercial vehicles. So it's really important to bring this fresh perspective from our Canadian neighbors. So today we'll hear from Joanna Kyriazis. She's a senior policy advisor with Clean Energy Canada. They're an NGO working to accelerate the transition to a clean economy there. So they're a close partner of CALSTART, a Drive to Zero pledge partner, and they really have been instrumental to launch Drive to Zero in Canada, which is definitely a priority for us, not only because of their environmental leadership, but also because of the need to create an integrated North American market for zero emissions and innovative commercial vehicles. So without further ado, let's go ahead.
So Joanna, thank you for being here today. And I know that Canada has made a strong commitment to zero emission buses. So could you give us more details on this commitment?
Thanks for having me today, Cristiano. Yes, so Canada has joined a small but growing group of countries, states, provinces, and cities by pledging to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Transportation accounts for about a quarter of our country's emissions. So electrifying buses and trucks are going to be a big part of meeting that 2050 target. As you mentioned, last year, Canada signed on to CALSTART's Global Drive to Zero pledge. And then the federal government built on this commitment by promising to get 5,000 zero-emission school and transit buses on the road in the next 5 years. Now, Clean Energy Canada has been hard at work engaging with cities, transit agencies, and other experts on some of the best policy and program ideas to help accelerate this transition and meet that 5,000 bus target and beyond.
So could you tell me a little bit how that engagement is going and what your expectations are for Canada's ability to deliver on this commitment?
The 5,000 bus commitment is certainly ambitious, but at least pre-COVID, transit agencies across the country were moving in the right direction. So we had a number of larger transit authorities in Vancouver, to Edmonton, to Toronto, to Montreal, ordering electric buses and making promises to stop purchasing diesel buses altogether by 2025 or earlier. Smaller cities and transit agencies were also on board with electrification and taking some of the first steps in electrifying their bus fleets, whether it was conducting feasibility studies or launching smaller pilot programs. Fleet managers know that electric buses tick all the boxes. They help to save them costs on fuel because electricity costs less to power up. Electric buses have fewer maintenance needs than a diesel-powered bus. We, of course, know electric buses produce no pollution, so they create healthier communities. And they're also visible demonstrations of climate action in motion. People love seeing electric buses zooming through their neighborhoods. And then finally, in places like Canada, electric buses provide an economic benefit because we are home to some leading electric bus and truck makers. So this is all to say that many agencies were on board making headway towards electrification, and they just needed some financial and technical support to overcome some of those upfront cost barriers and accelerate the transition. So that's where that federal government commitment came in, and that's where we were until the COVID pandemic hit.
So how do you think COVID will really impact Canada's ability to deploy the zero-emission buses?
The world has definitely changed, and certainly in the public transportation space. Transit agencies are seeing ridership levels drop, more than 80% in some areas. And many Canadian transit agencies rely fairly heavily on the fare box as a main source of revenue. And so a number of these are struggling to stay afloat financially. We have certainly had many questions and many people wondering, what is the future of public transit in a post-COVID world, and how does electrification fit into that? So the good news is that we have heard from the federal government that they remain committed to electrifying bus fleets in Canada. And then Clean Energy Canada believes that investments in public transportation that support high quality electrified transit, must be an essential component in any economic recovery package that we see coming out of the government. Maybe just briefly, I'll say we sort of see this playing out in three phases. So the first will be obviously emergency funding and immediate relief to transit agencies to make sure that we're sustaining service, keeping these operations running, keeping people safe. Transit is playing such a crucial role right now, getting essential healthcare and emergency workers to their jobs. So that sort of support is the first priority. Once the worst of COVID is over, and even now we're starting to see some parts of our economy reopen slowly, we're still expecting to see relatively low ridership and demand for public transit. People are afraid to share those enclosed spaces with each other. They're all set up working from home. Many don't have anywhere to go because their workplaces are still closed. So the next step is really going to be focusing on rebuilding confidence in public transportation. And we think the best way to do this is to invest in high quality transportation systems. In the near term, that will focus on making sure our buses are safe and clean. Maybe it's running more buses with fewer people. Maybe it's plexiglass barriers to keep the driver safe, that sort of thing. In the medium term, we may be seeing more investments in bus rapid transit lanes or dedicated bus lanes, let's say, to increase speed and service quality. And then finally, economic stimulus and recovery. It presents just a real opportunity to scale up our electrification efforts in our public bus fleets and build the transit systems of the future. We hear from transit agencies that their procurement cycles run 12 to 18 years. So that means that the investments we're making today are going to last for decades. And we can't lock in an old technology. So this is all to say, modernizing and electrifying our bus fleets it will help to maintain these high levels of confidence in our transit systems. And this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to reshape those transit systems for the future.
So, it was great to see this perspective from Canada. We also have partners in Europe, in China, in India, in Brazil, and many other regions. And we're going to continue to bring you this fresh perspectives from around the world in the coming weeks. So stay tuned.
Great, Cristiano, thank you for joining us today. And it really was great to hear the update from Joanna and what the team is doing in Canada. So appreciate that, and we will look for those updates. One of the things that's interesting is what's coming up next is something that we developed in California, but it is being used globally. Alicia, you've got a preview on our total cost of ownership calculator.
Yes, Bill, very excited to show the tool we've been waiting for today. And we have our colleague, Jonathan Norris, who's been key at developing this tool and getting it online. And I know that users have been really pleased to have the opportunity to evaluate the total cost of owning and operating zero to near zero trucks and buses. So Jonathan, looking forward to your presentation, and thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Alicia. All right, so Next slide, please. Happy to speak to you all about our HFIP total cost of ownership estimator. And as Bill mentioned, a suite of TCO tools that are really broadening in scope outside of California to the nation and international markets as well. Before I get into it, I just want to provide my contact information as well as a link. If you go back to the last slide, please, to the HFIP TCO estimator. My presentation is going to be brief, but I would love in the future to give any of you that are interested a deeper demonstration if you want more detail. So here's my email, and this is the link to the tool. Next slide. So as Bill mentioned, the current TCO estimator that we have has been built for the California HFIP program, a voucher incentive program here in the state of California. You can see a screenshot of some of the results that it provides here on the right. In a nutshell, essentially, we take user inputs, mostly from fleets and anyone else that has a stake in understanding the cost of owning and operating zero and near zero emission, medium and heavy duty vehicles compared to their baseline fueled counterparts. And we'll take inputs based on your duty cycle, based on the vehicles and your operations, and then provide two primary outputs. The first of which will be an estimate of the payback period that you can expect to see, the number of years you can expect to pay off the premium cost of that zero or near zero emission vehicle compared to the baseline vehicle based on any operating savings that you have, operating cost savings. The second piece of outputs that we provide to you is an itemized breakdown of costs, both in graphical and in text format. Next slide, please. So this is just showing you the purpose of the tool and a few pieces of overview on it. So as I mentioned, it really is aimed to give fleets a better sense of the direction of owning and operating certain types of vehicles. Next slide, please. And in order to get to those insights, it really takes quite a lot of input. So this is just a screenshot, a summary of all the inputs that we take into account through the tool. Anything from vehicle purchase price to maintenance compound annual growth rate and discount rate that you decide to put in there. It really does take quite a lot of information, but we made it as user-friendly as possible, and it's pretty simple to use according to the partners that we've vetted it with in our development. I also want to note that one potential limitation, since it's devoted to the HFIP program and was funded by that HFIP program, is currently the tool is only applicable to vehicle types and fuel types that are eligible through that HFIP program. So that will include battery electric vehicles, fuel cell electric vehicles, compressed natural gas, low NOx natural gas, diesel and gasoline vehicles. As we continue to build out the tool and improve it and expand it in scope, we will be taking other incentive programs at different states into account, other policies into account, as well as other vehicles and fuel types as well. Next slide. So just a quick overview of our future goals. So the version that we have up on the website for HFIP right now is the first version. We do have some really great plans to enhance that tool to a version 2.0. And so we're going to be continuing this year to do that. We also, as I mentioned, want to expand its applicability to other states. The New York voucher program is one example. It's not currently included in the tool now, but that's just an example of where we want to take it in the future. And then lending off of the Drive to Zero program and the great presentation you just heard from Chris Ciano and our Canadian partners, we're looking at opportunities to expand the TCO tool to more international markets. So please stay tuned. If you have any questions about this, or if you'd like a deeper dive into the tool, you have my email address, and I'd be happy to do that for you. That's all I got, Alicia.
Great. Thanks so much, Jonathan. I really appreciate all the good work you've been doing there, and excited about the opportunities for it to expand and be applied to international markets. Thanks again for that good update. And Bill, we'll turn it back to you.
No, thanks a lot. And I've been on several of the calls with Jonathan, with some of our partners in Europe and elsewhere, and it is exciting to see this collaboration around the world working on and trying to get the best tools up there and trying to find ways to tweak them so that they're useful in all regions. Well, one of the things we want to get a sense from you is what's useful to you. And as we continue to do our clean commercial transportation update, what kind of topics would you like us to continue to focus on and cover? We look for your email feedbacks, but we have a poll we'd like to put up as we close out for this week, this day before the Memorial Day weekend. And if Bonnie, if we could pull up the poll, we'd like to find out what topics are of most interest to you. And this will be good guidance to us. So let's take a few minutes and get your feedback. But where would you like us to be looking? Is it scaling infrastructure? Is it financial models? And you can see the rest of that in there. It could be maybe even policy, following policy development. So love to get your feedback.
I think this is an important question, Bill. You know, what I think is really great about our weekly update is the ability to really touch on topics that are important to everyone. I've really appreciated the interviews that we've had this week and last week, really focusing on, you know, how we're all coping with COVID and how we continue to maintain momentum. So definitely, this is a great opportunity for us to make sure that we're getting a pulse of what's important to folks.
Yeah, and if we can take a look, Bonnie, at that pulse, what the kind of responses did we get? Well, interesting. So incentives for commercial vehicles and infrastructure, maybe not surprisingly, topping the list as we've created some national campaigns around trying to get incentives. Alicia's leading a corridor campaign to get funding at the federal level. I'm leading a trucks campaign for infrastructure and vehicles. But interesting, scaling infrastructure, also very high innovative finance models. So this is great. This is a nice snapshot. Please give us feedback afterwards. We'll be sending further polls, but also send us an email, give us a call. We'd really like to communicate with you on this. Next week, we've actually got some great things coming. We'll have some more policy updates. A lot is happening both around the nation and in California on budgets and other issues, particularly with recovery planning coming. We've seen what's going on in Europe. We also, though, have a really cool additional tool. We call it the Funding Finder. And at least for people in California, this is a great tool that Alicia and her team have been working on to help people find all the sources of funding that's available in the state in kind of one-stop shopping. Some final thoughts as we close out today. And we know this is a weekend that usually people are celebrating, but also thinking about the folks who have fought to keep us safe and free. I think we should broaden the list of people on our minds on this weekend: healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, and others who have been on the front lines keeping us safe, if you will, and free once we recover. But also other people. I think when we think of who are really the essential workers, think about people who are working in stores, grocery stores, and others, making sure that we have produce, the supply chain, the logistics people who are keeping all of that product coming to us. Those are some of the people maybe we should also have on our minds on this Memorial Day weekend. And as we're thinking about them, let's also think about how do we find the cleanest, lowest carbon and safest products to keep those logistics chains going. I think we've all seen how essential they are, but I think we also know we need to do a lot more to make them sustainable as we move forward. So those are some final thoughts. Be safe, stay healthy, as we try to stay more connected than ever through this and other channels that we have. For Alicia Gildy and our full commercial vehicle team here at CalSTART, thank you so much for joining us. Have a great and safe holiday weekend. Goodbye.